To understand the First World War, we must go back to the turn of the 20th century. This was the Belle Epoque. There was a sense of progress as science and technology advanced. Beneath the surface lay stark contrasts and anxieties. Industrialization created urban slums. Europe's royal families were interconnected. The Europe of the early 1900s was caught between a romanticized past and an uncertain future. The peace was fragile. The beautiful era was standing on the edge of a precipice. Europe's stability rested on a rigid system of military alliances. These agreements bound nations to support each other in conflict. Intended to maintain the balance of power, this system ultimately turned a regional crisis into a global catastrophe, dividing the continent. The Triple Alliance, led by Germany, faced the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Great Britain. Mutual suspicion fueled a ruinous arms race. Nationalism and imperial rivalries fueled tensions in Europe. The 19th century saw nation-building but also destabilization within empires like Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans, with diverse ethnic groups yearning for independence. The Balkans became a powder keg. Serbia's ambition to unite South Slavs clashed with Austria-Hungary. Imperial rivalries, like the scramble for Africa, intensified competition for resources and prestige. Germany sought its place in the sun, leading to diplomatic clashes and military build-ups, adding fuel to the fire. As the 20th century began, a dangerous mood settled over Europe. Constant crises, the arms race, and nationalist propaganda created a culture of militarism. War was increasingly seen as inevitable. Germany's Schlieffen Plan assumed a two-front war. It planned a rapid attack on France through Belgium. These plans left little room for de-escalation. Newspapers amplified this mindset, often depicting foreign powers as aggressive. This jingoism created public enthusiasm for war. By 1914, Europe was armed and ready. The alliance system was a diplomatic tripwire. Any spark could become an inferno. All that was needed was a single event to set the continent ablaze. On June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie were assassinated. Serbian nationalists, part of a group called Young Bosnia, sought to strike a blow against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A wrong turn placed the Archduke's car in front of Gavrilo Princip, who fired the shots. The assassination ignited the powder keg of Europe. This act of violence set in motion a chain reaction that would soon consume the world. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in Vienna. For the hardliners within the Austro-Hungarian government, particularly Foreign Minister Leopold Berchtold and Chief of the General Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf, this was not just a tragedy, it was a golden opportunity. For years they had viewed Serbia as an existential threat to their multinational empire, a source of constant agitation that needed to be eliminated. The assassination, linked as it was to Serbian nationalist groups, provided the perfect pretext to settle the Serbian question once and for all through military force. They believed a swift, punitive war was necessary to restore the empire's prestige and crush the Pan-Slav movement for good. Before Austria-Hungary could act, however, it needed to be certain of the position of its powerful ally, Germany. A war against Serbia was almost certain to involve Serbia's protector, the massive Russian Empire. Austria-Hungary knew it could not face Russia alone. It needed unwavering German support. On July 5, 1914, an Austrian envoy was dispatched to Berlin to meet with Kaiser Wilhelm II and his Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg. The Austrians sought to know if Germany would back them in taking action against Serbia, even if it meant risking a wider European war. This was the critical moment where a localized crisis could either be contained or escalated into a continental conflict. The German response was swift, unequivocal, and ultimately catastrophic. The Kaiser and his government offered Austria-Hungary their full and unconditional support. They urged Vienna to act quickly and decisively against Serbia, believing that a swift military operation would present Europe with a before other powers could intervene. This famous German pledge became known as the blank check. It was frankly an extraordinary gamble. Germany was effectively giving its weaker, more volatile ally a free hand to start a war in the Balkans, promising to stand by Vienna's side no matter the consequences. The German leadership believed that Russia was not yet ready for a major war and would likely back down. The reasoning behind Germany's fateful decision was complex. The German military felt that if a major European war was inevitable, it was better to have it in 1914 than a few years later when Russia's army would be even stronger and its railway network more developed. They saw an opportunity to support their only reliable ally, break up the Triple Entente and improve their own strategic position in Europe. They catastrophically misjudged the situation, underestimating the resolve of Russia and the likelihood of British intervention. With the blank check in hand, the war party in Vienna was emboldened. The brakes on a military solution were removed and the road to war was now wide open. Armed with Germany's blank check, the Austro-Hungarian government spent the next few weeks carefully crafting its move. They did not want to appear as the aggressors. Instead, they planned to issue an ultimatum to Serbia with demands so harsh and humiliating that they were almost certain to be rejected. This rejection would provide the perfect justification for war. The ultimatum was deliberately delayed until late July, ensuring the French president and prime minister would be at sea, making it difficult for the Entente allies to coordinate. It was calculated diplomatic brinkmanship designed to provoke conflict on Vienna's terms. On the evening of July 23, 1914, the ultimatum was finally delivered to Belgrade. It was a stunning document. It accused Serbia of tolerating nationalist propaganda that led to the assassination. It presented a list of 10 demands. These included suppression of anti-Austrian publications, dissolution of organizations like the Black Hand, dismissal of Serbian officials named by Vienna, and most provocatively, allowing Austro-Hungarian officials to participate in investigations on Serbian soil. This was a direct challenge to Serbian sovereignty. Serbia was given just 48 hours to reply. This short deadline prevented other powers from mediating. The news sent a jolt of alarm across Europe. It was clear Austria-Hungary was intent on war. Sir Edward Grey famously remarked he had never seen one state address another with a document of so formidable a character. Serbia was thrown into panic, caught between invasion and humiliation. In a desperate attempt to avert war, Serbia crafted a masterful reply. They accepted 9 of the 10 demands, agreeing to almost everything requested. They only rejected allowing Austrian officials within Serbia, citing constitutional violations. They suggested referring this to The Hague for arbitration. It was an incredibly conciliatory response, but Austria-Hungary's war party wasn't seeking diplomacy. They were looking for war, and Serbia's partial rejection gave them their excuse. The Serbian reply, though remarkably accommodating, was exactly what Vienna had hoped for, a partial rejection. On July 28, 1914, precisely 1 month after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The first shots of the war were fired the next day, as Austrian artillery began to bombard the Serbian capital of Belgrade across the Danube River. The regional crisis that European diplomats had feared for decades had finally erupted into open conflict. But this was not just a war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. The rigid alliance system, the diplomatic tripwire that had been laid across the continent, was now activated. The first domino had fallen. Russia, seeing itself as the great protector of all Slavic peoples, could not stand by and watch as Serbia, its small Balkan client state, was crushed by Austria-Hungary. To do so would be a catastrophic blow to its prestige and influence in the region. On July 30th, after a series of confused and hesitant orders, Tsar Nicholas II, under immense pressure from his generals, gave the order for the full mobilization of the vast Russian army. This was a momentous step. In the military thinking of 1914, mobilization was seen as an act of war. It set in motion an irreversible, continent-spanning logistical operation involving millions of men, horses and supplies, all moving towards the frontiers according to rigid, predetermined timetables. Russia's mobilization triggered an immediate and frantic reaction in Berlin. The German generals saw the Russian army gathering on their eastern border as a direct threat. More importantly, it activated the logic of their own war plan, the Schlieffen Plan. This plan depended entirely on speed, on defeating France in the west before the slow-moving Russian steamroller could fully deploy in the east. The German military believed that every hour Russia mobilized was an hour lost for their campaign against France. On July 31st, Germany issued its own ultimatums. One was sent to Russia demanding it cease all military preparations within 12 hours. Another was sent to France, Russia's ally, demanding it pledge its neutrality in a Russo-German war. Neither country could possibly accept these terms. Russia could not demobilize without suffering a complete diplomatic humiliation, and France could not abandon its key ally and leave itself isolated against a triumphant Germany. The French replied that they would act in accordance with their own interests. Russia gave no reply at all. The diplomatic channels were closing down and the generals were now in control. The cascade was unstoppable. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. The alliance system was now dragging the great powers of Europe one by one over the precipice and into the abyss. The Balkan War was now officially a European war. Germany's war declaration on Russia turned all eyes to France, bound by alliance. France mobilized August 1st, as the German Schlieffen Plan commenced, declaring war on France August 3rd. The West joined the East, Central Powers against the Entente. Britain entered when Germany invaded neutral Belgium, violating the Treaty of London. This galvanized British opinion. On August 4th, Britain declared war. The conflict became a world war, drawing in Britain's empire. A Balkan assassination sparked global conflict. The lamps are going out all over Europe. As war declarations cascaded across Europe in early August 1914, a feverish atmosphere took hold. Patriotic fervor swept the continent, a collective outburst of nationalism known as the Spirit of 1914. Vast crowds celebrated, believing the war would be a short, glorious affair over by Christmas. Young men rushed to enlist. The machinery of modern warfare was grinding into motion. Reservists boarded trains towards the frontiers. Railway networks transformed into arteries of war. Soldiers in brightly colored uniforms marched off, unaware of the horrors awaiting them. Germany's Schlieffen Plan aimed to quickly defeat France before Russia mobilized. German armies invaded neutral Belgium, planning to encircle French forces and capture Paris. Unexpected Belgian resistance disrupted the timetable, buying time for the Allies. The invasion was marked by terror against Belgian civilians, seized upon by Allied propaganda. By late August, German forces drove deep into France, but the Schlieffen Plan was on the verge of failing. The French and British retreated, and the fate of France hung in the balance. While the German right wing was scything through Belgium, the French army was launching its own offensive according to its pre-war strategy, Plan 17. This plan was the polar opposite of the German one. It was a straightforward, head-on assault driven by the philosophy of élan vital, the belief in the power of fighting spirit and the offensive at all costs. French armies, clad in their conspicuous blue and red uniforms, charged into the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, which had been annexed by Germany in 1871. They expected to be greeted as liberators. Instead, they ran headlong into well-prepared German defensive positions, armed with devastating machine guns and modern heavy artillery. The French offensive was a catastrophic failure. The series of clashes that took place along the Franco-German and Franco-Belgian borders in mid-August became known as the Battle of the Frontiers. It was frankly a bloodbath for the French army. Their courageous but suicidal bayonet charges were mown down in waves by German firepower. In a single day, August 22, 1914, the French army suffered nearly 27,000 men killed, making it the single deadliest day in French military history. The romantic illusions of a swift and glorious war were shattered in these opening encounters, replaced by the brutal reality of industrial-scale slaughter. The failure of Plan 17 was total, and the French armies were sent reeling backwards in disarray, their offensive spirit broken. With the French plan in tatters and the German right wing advancing relentlessly towards Paris, the Allied armies were forced into a desperate fighting withdrawal. This became known as the Great Retreat. For nearly 2 weeks, the French and the British Expeditionary Force fell back under immense pressure, covering hundreds of miles. The BEF, though small, was a highly professional force, and its riflemen were so proficient that the Germans often mistook their rapid fire for machine guns. They fought crucial rearguard actions at battles like Mons and Le Cateau, slowing the German advance just enough to prevent the Allied line from collapsing entirely. But they could not stop it. The retreat was a grueling ordeal for the soldiers. They marched day and night, often with little food or rest, constantly harassed by the pursuing Germans. The summer of 1914 was exceptionally hot, and the men suffered terribly from exhaustion, thirst, and the psychological strain of constant retreat. It seemed to many that the war was already lost. The German armies were now on the outskirts of Paris, farther than they would advance for the next 4 years. The French commander-in-chief, Joseph Joffre, remained remarkably calm under the pressure, working frantically to regroup his shattered armies and pull forces from his right wing to form a new army to defend the capital. A decisive battle was imminent. By September 1914, the German army neared total victory on the Western Front. However, General Alexander von Kluck's fateful decision to pursue retreating French forces exposed his flank. The Allied forces struck, beginning the First Battle of the Marne. The German advance was halted. Paris was saved. The Allied victory was hailed as the miracle on the Marne. Simultaneously, Russia mobilized faster than expected. Hindenburg and Ludendorff's German Eighth Army destroyed the Russian Second Army near Tannenberg. This miracle of Tannenberg saved Germany from invasion. Following the German retreat at the Marne, the war on the Western Front changed. This initiated the race to the sea as armies maneuvered north. Bloody, inconclusive battles extended the fighting line to the North Sea. The First Battle of Ypres was a brutal struggle. By late November, a continuous line stretched over 400 miles. Soldiers dug trenches which became permanent fortifications. This marked the birth of the Western Front, a landscape of mud, barbed wire, and death. The war of movement bogged down into a war of attrition. A new, terrible form of warfare had begun. The stalemate had begun. The conflict expanded into a true world war as European powers drew in their vast empires. These empires provided vital manpower and resources. The war was fought on the seas and in distant colonies. Britain blockaded Germany, while Japan seized German territories in China and the Pacific. German colonies in Africa became battlegrounds. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, closing the Dardanelles Strait. The war had encircled the globe, a long global struggle fought across the entire planet. By the end of 1914, the war of movement had halted. The failure of Germany's Schlieffen Plan and the race to the sea resulted in a continuous line of armies. With no open flanks, armies dug into the earth, creating the Western Front. Armies faced each other across no man's land. Trenches became sophisticated systems. The war became a gruesome war of attrition. The deadlock ensured a long, brutal struggle, turning home fronts into factories of war. For soldiers on the Western Front, life was relentless misery and terror. The battlefields were notorious for mud. This mud filled trenches and even sucked soldiers' boots from their feet. Constant exposure to wet and cold led to trench foot. Rats and lice infested the trenches. The daily routine was a cycle of boredom and vigilance, with constant threat of snipers and artillery. Amidst the horror, soldiers coped with humor and comradeship. Many suffered from shell shock or PTSD. The reality was mud, rats, lice, and fear. The stalemate spurred a frantic technological race as each side sought a new weapon. The dominant weapon was the machine gun, which enforced the stalemate. Artillery underwent a massive transformation, becoming the king of battle. This created the shattered lunar landscapes characteristic of the Western Front. The Germans introduced a terrifying new weapon: poison gas. The British developed a revolutionary new machine, the tank. These new tools of industrial slaughter reshaped the battlefield, making the war more mechanized and deadly. By 1916, German General Falkenhayn aimed to break the French army through attrition. He targeted Verdun, a symbol of French resolve, intending to bleed France dry. The German offensive began with intense artillery bombardment. General Pétain rallied his troops. They shall not pass. The battle devolved into a brutal 10-month struggle. Verdun became known as the meat grinder. The battle ended with front lines unchanged. The cost was staggering, over 700,000 casualties, epitomizing the war's senseless slaughter. While the French were at Verdun, the British planned an offensive to relieve them and break through the Western Front. General Haig planned a massive assault, hoping to shatter German lines. The battle began July 1st, 1916, after a week-long artillery bombardment. Tens of thousands of soldiers advanced across no man's land, but the barrage had failed. They were mown down by machine guns, resulting in over 57,000 casualties on the first day alone. The battle continued for months, becoming a brutal war of attrition with minimal gains and astronomical casualties on both sides. While the armies were locked in the mud of the trenches, a new battlefield was opening up in the skies above. At the start of the war, aircraft were fragile machines made of wood and fabric, used primarily for reconnaissance to spot enemy troop movements and direct artillery fire. Pilots initially exchanged friendly waves when they passed each other. Soon, however, they began taking pot shots with pistols and rifles. This quickly escalated into a technological arms race to create dedicated fighter aircraft. The development of synchronization gear, which allowed a machine gun to fire forward through the propeller blades without hitting them, turned the airplane into a deadly weapon. The skies over the Western Front became a new arena for combat, producing a new kind of hero, the flying ace. Pilots like Germany's Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, and France's René Fonck became household names, their individual kill counts celebrated in newspapers back home. These knights of the air engaged in swirling dogfights, a deadly ballet of skill and courage that seemed a world away from the anonymous, industrial slaughter on the ground. Beyond the dogfights, aircraft took on new roles. Strategic bombers were developed to attack factories, railways, and even cities far behind the front lines, bringing the war home to civilians in a way that had never been possible before. At sea, the war was dominated by Great Britain's Royal Navy, which imposed a crushing naval blockade on Germany. This blockade slowly strangled the German economy, causing severe shortages of food and essential raw materials for the war effort. The German High Seas Fleet, unable to challenge the larger British Grand Fleet in a decisive battle, mostly remained in port. The one major naval engagement of the war, the Battle of Jutland in 1916, was a huge and complex clash of dreadnought battleships. While the Germans sank more ships and inflicted more casualties, the British fleet remained in control of the North Sea, and the strategic situation, the blockade, was unchanged. Unable to break the surface blockade, Germany turned to a devastating new weapon to strike back at Britain, the submarine or U-boat. In 1915, and again more decisively in 1917, Germany declared a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, targeting not only Allied warships but also any merchant ships heading to Britain, including those from neutral countries. U-boats torpedoed vessels without warning, causing massive losses to Allied shipping and threatening to starve Britain into submission. This strategy, however, was a huge political gamble. The sinking of passenger liners with neutral citizens aboard, most famously the Lusitania in 1915, caused outrage in the United States and would ultimately play a crucial role in pushing the Americans towards joining the war on the Allied side. While the Western Front dominates our memory of the First World War, the conflict was a truly global struggle. These forgotten theaters of war were vast and strategically vital. On the Eastern Front, the scale of warfare was immense. Here the armies of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Russian Empire clashed. Unlike the static trenches of France, the war in the East was one of movement. Another often overlooked front was in the mountains of northern Italy. Here soldiers fought a brutal war in some of the most challenging terrain imaginable. This White War was a unique hell of rock, ice, and snow. These forgotten fronts were integral parts of the global conflict, contributing decisively to the eventual collapse of empires. With the Ottoman Empire's entry into the war, new fronts opened across the Middle East. One major Allied operation was to force a sea route to Russia. In 1915, an Anglo-French force invaded the Gallipoli Peninsula. The Gallipoli campaign was a bloody failure. Gallipoli was a disaster for the Allies. Elsewhere in Mesopotamia, a British Indian force advanced. They eventually captured Baghdad in 1917. Another British-led force captured Jerusalem in December 1917. This war was also the stage for the Arab Revolt. T.E. Lawrence encouraged Arab tribes to rise up against Ottoman rulers. This played a crucial role in the Allied victory. The war destroyed the Ottoman Empire. The First World War was a conflict between European empires fought across their vast colonial possessions. The colonies provided resources and manpower. Over 2.5 million soldiers and laborers from across the British and French empires were mobilized. The contribution of these imperial troops was immense. These men were often fighting for an empire that denied them freedoms, fueling independence movements after the war. The war was also fought directly on colonial territory, particularly in Africa. The war in the colonies exploited imperial subjects and drained colonial resources. It would fundamentally reshape the global political landscape. The year 1917 marked a critical turning point in the war, a period of profound crisis and change for both sides. 3 years of relentless, attritional warfare had pushed every combatant nation to the brink of collapse. The home fronts were cracking under the immense strain. Food and fuel shortages were becoming severe, particularly in Germany, due to the British naval blockade. The patriotic fervour of 1914 had long since evaporated, replaced by war weariness, dissent and social unrest. In France, after the catastrophic failure of the Nivelle offensive, large parts of the army mutinied, refusing to launch any more suicidal attacks. The crisis was overcome, but it revealed just how fragile morale had become. The most significant event of this year of crisis occurred on the Eastern Front. The Russian Empire, already teetering on the edge of collapse, finally crumbled. The war had been a catastrophe for Russia, exposing the incompetence of the Tsarist regime and leading to millions of casualties and severe economic hardship. In March 1917, or February in the old Russian calendar, food riots and strikes in the capital, Petrograd, escalated into a full-blown revolution. The army, ordered to suppress the protests, sided with the people. With his authority gone, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, ending centuries of Romanov rule. A provisional government took power, promising democratic reforms but vowing to continue the war, a decision that would prove fatal. The provisional government failed to solve Russia's deep-seated problems and the war continued to go badly. This created an opening for a radical group of revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, led by the charismatic Vladimir Lenin. With slogans like peace, land and bread, Lenin promised to end the war, redistribute land to the peasants and give power to the people. In November 1917, or October in the Russian calendar, the Bolsheviks seized power in a second revolution, a nearly bloodless coup in Petrograd. One of Lenin's first acts was to seek an immediate armistice with Germany. The war on the Eastern Front was effectively over. The collapse of Russia was a seismic event with enormous consequences for the war. For the Central Powers, it was a moment of triumph. They were now free from a two-front war. Germany could transfer hundreds of thousands of its best troops from the Eastern Front to the West, giving them a decisive numerical advantage. They planned to use these reinforcements to launch a final war-winning offensive in the spring of 1918, before the full weight of American power could be felt. For the Allies, Russia's exit was a disaster, a dark moment that seemed to herald their own defeat. The fate of the war now rested on one crucial question: could they hold on long enough for a new ally to arrive? Since the beginning of the war in 1914, the United States had maintained an official policy of neutrality. Two key German actions ultimately pushed the United States into the war: unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram. The telegram proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico against the US. On April 6, 1917, President Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. The United States began a massive mobilization of its industrial and military might, and the arrival of American soldiers would provide crucial reinforcements. The collapse of Russia in 1917 presented Germany with a unique opportunity. Germany transferred troops to the west, under General Erich Ludendorff. Ludendorff planned a massive offensive to break Allied lines before American forces arrived. It was a desperate gamble, as Germany was starved by the British blockade. Operation Michael employed innovative stormtrooper tactics. On March 21, 1918, the spring offensive began. The German stormtroopers broke through British lines with terrifying speed. The stalemate was broken, but the offensive lost momentum due to exhausted troops and supply problems. The German army bled itself white, its last reserves spent on indecisive gains. By July 1918, the German spring offensive had halted. The army was exhausted with nearly 1 million casualties. Fresh American troops were arriving in France. Under General Foch, the Allies struck back. A combined French and American force launched a counterattack, forcing the Germans into retreat. The turning point came on August 8th at the Battle of Amiens. British, Australian and Canadian forces smashed through the German lines. Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German army, knowing the war could not be won. The victory kicked off the 100 Days Offensive. In late September, the Allies launched a massive assault along the Hindenburg Line. British, Australian, Canadian, French, and American troops breached the line. The road to victory was clear and the end of the war was in sight. While the German army was being hammered, its allies were collapsing. The strain of war had proven too much for the old empires. Bulgaria was first, signing an armistice in September 1918. The Ottoman Empire followed in October. Austria-Hungary disintegrated from within, signing an armistice in November. In Germany, the military was in retreat and the people were starving. Revolution broke out and Kaiser Wilhelm was forced to abdicate. A new German republic was proclaimed, seeking an end to the fighting. With Germany in revolution and retreat, the new government sued for peace. A German delegation met Allied commander Ferdinand Foch to negotiate an armistice. The meeting occurred in Foch's railway carriage in Compiègne, France. Foch presented harsh terms designed to prevent Germany from resuming the war. The Allies demanded territory, naval power, and military equipment. The German delegation was horrified, but they had no alternative. The armistice was signed at Compiègne on November 11, 1918. At 11 o'clock, silence fell across the Western Front. The war was over. In 1919, the victorious Allied leaders Wilson, Lloyd Georges, Clemenceau, and Orlando met in Paris to decide the fate of a defeated Germany which was excluded from negotiations. Wilson pushed for his 14 points and a League of Nations, but Clemenceau demanded harsh penalties to ensure France's security. The resulting Treaty of Versailles, signed 5 years after the war began, was a compromise that satisfied no one. Germany was forced to accept sole blame for the war, pay crippling reparations, lose territory, and drastically reduce its military. Many Germans saw the treaty as a humiliating diktat, while some allies thought it was either too harsh or too lenient. The US Senate refused to ratify the treaty or join the League of Nations, weakening hopes for lasting peace. Instead of ending conflict, the treaty's legacy of resentment and instability set the stage for another, even more devastating world war. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, the world faced the staggering human cost of the First World War. Over 70 million men fought. Nearly 10 million soldiers died, with millions more wounded or missing. France, Germany, Russia, and Britain each lost vast numbers, while smaller nations like Serbia suffered catastrophic losses. Survivors returned home with shattered bodies and minds, haunted by trauma we now call PTSD. Civilians suffered too. Starvation, occupation, and atrocities like the Armenian genocide claimed millions more. The 1918 Spanish flu, spread by troop movements, killed at least 50 million worldwide, compounding the tragedy. The war left a lost generation and a world forever marked by grief and loss. The war shattered Europe's old empires, Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman, redrawing the map entirely. New nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and the Baltic states emerged, inspired by Wilson's call for self-determination. Yet borders were drawn hastily, creating new minorities and tensions that would fuel future conflicts. Millions found themselves under foreign rule, sowing seeds of resentment and instability. The war weakened colonial powers and elevated the United States as a global economic leader, even as it retreated into isolationism. In the colonies, returning soldiers demanded the freedoms they had fought for, igniting anti-colonial movements. The collapse of empires set the stage for both new hopes and new dangers in the 20th century. The war upended social hierarchies, as soldiers from all backgrounds fought side by side and returned unwilling to accept old inequalities. Women filled vital roles in factories, offices, and hospitals, proving their capabilities and accelerating the push for suffrage. After the war, women gained the right to vote in Britain, the US, Germany, and beyond, marking a leap toward gender equality. The trauma of war shattered pre-war optimism, fueling a wave of disillusionment in art, literature, and culture. Modernist writers and artists captured the sense of a broken world, while movements like Dada mocked the absurdity of conflict. The flapper of the 1920s embodied the new spirit of independence born from wartime change. The Great War left a deep scar on society, challenging old values and reshaping the modern world. The war's economic toll was immense. Europe was left bankrupt, owing vast sums to the now dominant United States. Cities and industries lay in ruins, and Germany's reparations payments fueled hyperinflation and political unrest. The global trading system collapsed, replaced by protectionism and fierce new competition from the US and Japan. War debts and economic instability made recovery fragile throughout the 1920s. When the Wall Street crash hit in 1929, the world economy plunged into the Great Depression. Economic desperation, especially in Germany, paved the way for extremist movements promising national revival. The unresolved financial and political crises of the post-war years set the stage for even greater turmoil ahead. The First World War, optimistically dubbed the war to end all wars, proved a bitter illusion. The Treaty of Versailles failed to resolve underlying tensions and created new grievances. The treaty left a poisoned legacy of resentment and instability. It allowed extremist politicians like Adolf Hitler to build their platform on rejecting the treaty and restoring German honor. Flawed national self-determination left millions as resentful minorities, focal points of tension. The war brutalized a generation and set the stage for a second, more terrible round of fighting. The First World War reshaped our world. Its legacy is etched in the borders of Europe and the Middle East. Memorials stand as silent witnesses to the sacrifice. The annual act of remembrance serves as a solemn promise to never forget. It connects us to the grief of that conflict. The war gave us the poetry of Owen and Sassoon defining the brutal reality of combat. It reminds us of the fragility of peace, lest we